and good company, and also to continue some of the conversations that'll start here today. So without further ado, actually, I want to check, do we have any other logistics?
Exec team of a rural solar company in sub-Saharan Africa. So I had a few years in Uganda and Zambia. And that's really what motivated me to work where climate and human well-being overlaps. And we'll come back to that in a second. But first, a shout out to my advisor, David Lobel. He was guiding me through the whole quarter. And what we'll go through today is three things: the problem and research statement, what we learned, and then what that means in terms of recommendations for next steps. Diving into the problem, I kind of alluded to this, but my perspective is that improving access to nitrogen fertilizers is one of the biggest problems we have to address at the intersection of climate and human well-being. First of all, the population of sub-Saharan Africa is expected to double over the course of the next 2 decades. At the same time, agricultural yields are 1/5 what we see here in the US. So that means it takes 5 times as much land to produce the same amount of food. And there are 2 things I want to highlight on this point. First, on emissions, if we do not improve yields, then we need more land. When we need more land, we convert land use and release CO2 because of biomass. And amounts, the estimates vary, but it's up to 0.5 gigaton per year. The second point I want to make is on the human well-being front. Depending on the country, the majority of land of agricultural production in sub-Saharan Africa is managed by smallholders. So it's not a niche. And these smallholders have very low and volatile incomes. So increasing yields has a direct impact on their economic well-being, if you can do it profitably, and their human well-being. So why doesn't it happen? Why don't we have higher yields? There are a bunch of reasons, and I don't want to simplify them, but almost everyone agrees that increased nitrogen application is a big part of the solution. Current application rates are about 15 kilograms per hectare, where in the US we're at 70, in East Asia it's over 100. So the natural question is, why is that the case? And to do that, I want to introduce you to Haber-Bosch facilities. These are massive, and what they do is merge nitrogen with hydrogen to produce ammonia. They cost usually a minimum of $1 billion, and as a result, they don't get built everywhere, especially sub-Saharan Africa, with some exceptions. So what you have to do is ship in your nitrogen fertilizer, first to a port, and then distribute it within the country. The implication is that this fertilizer is expensive, 3 to 6 times what we pay in the US. What you see in terms of these maps, look at the blue bits, that's where it's most affordable. The rate is $2 per kilogram of nitrogen. This is over 5 times what we pay historically in the US. The good news is there are some innovations on the horizon. There are a number of companies that have come up with new ways to produce ammonia at smaller scale, so you don't have the same CapEx barriers that you see with Haber-Bosch. But, and I should say, that comes in, the first contracts are coming in at about $1 per kilogram of nitrogen, so half of the lowest cost price that we saw in the previous slide. But ammonia has its own set of problems. If you were to just have you couldn't just have ammonia here in this room, it would immediately volatilize to gas. So what we have to do to use it as a fertilizer is compress it, like you see in these tanks, and then inject it into the soil 4 to 8 inches below the surface. We do that in the US, and we're mechanized. This is in direct contrast to how smallholder farms work, which are labor intensive, and if they're fertilizing, it's usually granular, meaning solid state fertilizer, hand dosed right at the root. So this gets to the research question. How do we enable smallholders to tap in to this rise in decentralized low-cost ammonia production? What are some pathways? And the goal is to give recommendations to these decentralized ammonia companies for how they could pursue this opportunity. So let's dig into what we learned. First of all, the outcome that we were hoping to achieve, and I guess I was hoping to achieve, was an evaluation of different pathways for accomplishing this. First, across economics, because that's very important. What are the raw inputs, the distribution costs, the operating expense, especially energy, and the capital expense that are required? But fully recognizing that, that economics is only part of the puzzle, I took a holistic capital assets framework evaluating how knowledge, social and manufactured, natural, and human capital will be impacted by these different pathways. Methods, pretty straightforward, tapping into what's in the industry. Fertilizer industry has been around for a while. And 2, expert input, about 70 chats with people who are very, very knowledgeable, both structured and semi-structured. What did we learn? I'm going to go through quickly 3 broad approaches for how to make ammonia useful, and then 6 different pathways. I'm going to move quickly, so if you have questions, remember them. The first broad approach is called aqua ammonia. You dissolve the ammonia into water. Then you don't have the volatilization problem we talked about. The first pathway is called fertigation, so you run it into existing irrigation systems. The economics are very favorable. A limitation is the manufactured capital, in the sense that almost 0 smallholder farmers already have irrigation in place, so potential scale is limited. The second pathway, still under aqua ammonia, knapsacks. I'm sure you've seen these, but imagine it being filled with aqua ammonia and you actually dribble it along the crops. Economics, again, relatively favorable. There is some cost associated with building out the distribution network and on-farm storage. So that is, but it's relatively low. That will be the barrier because it is a fundamentally different distribution network that's required. The second broad approach is to convert ammonia to a solid state. And so the first pathway under that is urea, which is the most common globally. It's essentially a non-starter for decentralized applications because you need a source of CO2 as part of the chemical pathway it goes through. And for small scale, that's too expensive, prohibitively expensive. Next, I looked at ammonium nitrate. The cost is tenable, a bit higher, but tenable, and that's because you have to include a way to produce nitric acid. In terms of the capital assets, though, this is where it hits a dead end. Many governments do not allow ammonium nitrate because it can be used in explosives. Even though many agronomists argue it is a superior form of nitrogen fertilizer. So for that reason, not a great one. But this is the one I'm most excited about. So if you listen to any, maybe tune in right now. Ammonium sulfate. It does have an incremental cost, and that's because you need sulfuric acid in the production process. But that reaction can be scaled down because it doesn't require additional energy input. So the cost is moderately higher, 50% higher, $1.50 per kilogram. But where I get really excited is when you start looking at the capital asset evaluation. First, on the manufactured capital, there are already sulfuric acid plants. They exist because it's used in mining. And so it's possible to imagine piggybacking on that existing infrastructure. The second piece, which is really important, has to do with the natural capital of the soils themselves. In sub-Saharan Africa in particular, sulfur is a limiting nutrient, micronutrient that is often constraining, and lit reviews have shown an average of 25% yield increase by including sulfur, holding nitrogen constant. So that is why I'm excited about ammonium sulfate. The final approach is looking at business model innovation and a pathway termed fertilization as a service. You would imagine these decentralized ammonia production companies taking on the investment of the nurse tanks, toolbar, and tractor, and then paying or asking for a $1 per hectare payment. The economics are very favorable if you can get the utilization rate of the plant and the equipment to be high enough. And so the implication here is it really depends on if you can line up guaranteed customers. So in terms of next steps, my purpose was to have this very directed at the decentralized ammonia production companies, and so we'll just quickly tick through them. On the fertigation side, integrate with existing irrigation systems. Tap into that existing manufactured capital. For knapsacks, you will need to have someone who already has a network of smallholder farmers, and there are organizations like 1 Acre Fund that could be a good fit for this. For urea, I would say skip. I would suggest the same for ammonium nitrate, with the caveat that there is a sizable market in selling to mines who need this for explosives anyway. Ammonium sulfate, again, I'm most excited about this. It's design and price what a small-scale production facility would look like alongside an existing sulfuric acid plant. And then finally, for fertilization as a service, it's get out there and see if there's some groups of farms, both commercial and smallholder, that can provide the sufficient utilization to make this happen. So with that, I open up to questions.
Increasing the accessibility of nitrogen-based fertilizers such that yields in the short term, which are very, very, very low, and increase to meet these needs, but then over the long term, think about reducing the, or just being careful about an over application fertilizer and adoption to more.
Yeah, completely agree, because we've seen many challenges with that, including like the Yaqui Valley, which Stanford has been very involved with. And I came up in the capital asset evaluation. So in short, these decentralized ammonia production companies will need to have controls in place so you don't have incentives to over-apply. And that is a risk when you think about if a facility is going to be producing ammonia regardless and it doesn't have a place to go, what do you do? So I didn't touch on that in the presentation, but that is a big component of the capital asset evaluation. Sid.
Really great presentation. Love the combination of economics and capital assets. You know, one thing we were talking about in the last conversation was the big constraint in developing countries and development economics will play fertilizer, the cost of capital, right? So, you know, in India, the way they've gotten adoption of fertilizer up is that they subsidize, right, loans for agriculture, right? You know, many developing countries, especially in Africa, are dealing with solvency issues now. If you were to define a framework for reducing the cost of capital for, let's say, green bonds in developing countries in a way that would be agnostic to different technologies, let's say specifically in this sector, how would you think about that?
That sounds like a Nobel Prize winning question. I don't know. I will say the benefit, like applying it specifically to decentralized ammonia application, the benefit is these costs are coming in so much lower, and like the dollar per kg of nitrogen, that you do have a lot of the like necessary return to overcome the perceived or real risk of the investment in that dollar per kg. And so there are, I know that there are high assumptions already, so that potentially as risks actually go down, then you would actually also see the price go down from $1 per kg. That really didn't answer your question other than to say, oh, it's embedded. All right. Anything else? Yeah, Nicole. Oh.
Use the mic. I'm happy to do that. For the folks on Zoom.
Oh.
Test. Is that working? Great. So first of all, really interesting questions, and I love that you use so many interviews. That's one of my favorite methods. So in a couple of them, other way. Play microphone, which it feels that way anyway, since we can't hear it. So in a couple of them, you mentioned some of the challenges around behavior change challenges and also social norms. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to that. So with the behavior change, you mentioned that with knapsacks, and then the norms, that was related to the fertilizer as a service, which I think is really interesting. Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering if you could expound a bit on how you might think about changing either some of the norms or addressing some of the behavior change challenges.
Yeah, so both are challenges. On the behavior side, the big difference is moving from solid to some sort of liquid form. And a nuance that I didn't have a chance to get into is also there's a safety component to the behavior change. So with ammonia and even aqua ammonia, it reacts violently with water. That's what allows it to dissolve so easily. So you have to make sure that it doesn't get into your eyes, you can't breathe it in or anything like that, because it can cause serious issues. And so, yeah, I think it will be a real challenge to think about how do you get every, let's say, a million smallholder farmers to use a knapsack sprayer appropriately. And really, it has to be a knapsack dribbler as well, because how you spray matters for how much of the ammonia actually evaporates off or volatilizes. And so that is why I put a little yellow dot next to that one. Astute question. In terms of the norms, I think how we thought about that, or how I thought about that, is also thinking about like real or perceived risks. And so doing anything that is new or out of the ordinary is like a bigger barrier to overcome for anyone, but I think that's especially true for farmers. At least we saw that we're selling to farmers, selling solar to farmers. So that's really where the fertilization as a service. I wonder how it will be perceived. I will say the flip side of that coin is, in some ways, it does reduce the risk for the farm because they don't have to make as much of an investment. It's just, here's my cash per acre. So. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I didn't ask 30 questions.
No, Sid, you have great questions.
So one of the reasons we're having a fertilizer crisis right now is the cost of natural gas has gone up a lot, right? So the two are kind of fundamentally linked.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about hybrid bash plants. Do any of these technologies play a role in mitigating that link between the cost of natural gas and the cost of fertilizer?
Yeah, all of them do.
Okay.
Because they're using decentralized ammonia production, which certainly all the ones I put up there, that is driven by renewables. You have low cost renewables that allow you to do things that we weren't able to do before.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. So this gets at another broader point, which again, we didn't have time to get into, but I think these smaller scale production facilities have great benefits for food security at a national level as well. So you don't have individual countries that are exposed to global commodities.